Anne, she's younger than you, and she's pregnant with my child. My husband said it at the party, then pulled his mistress close by the waist. He smirked. I should have left you a long time ago, Anne. But when she turned her face toward me, I froze. The glass slipped from my hand and shattered across the marble floor. Anne. The entire rooftop ballroom went silent, because the woman standing beside my husband was my little sister. There are certain moments in life that split your existence into two parts. Anne, the person you used to be, and the person forced to rise from the wreckage afterward. For me, that moment happened on a cold October night in downtown Chicago, and 23 floors above the city beneath golden chandelier lights and the soft clinking of champagne glasses. Until then, I had believed my marriage was wounded, not dead. I was wrong, and the party had been Daniel's idea naturally. My husband loved public admiration, the way some men loved whiskey or gambling, and he fed on attention, on praise, on the subtle power of walking into a room and knowing everyone would turn toward him. After nearly 20 years of marriage, I had learned how to stand beside that kind of man without disappearing completely, though sometimes it felt dangerously close. The rooftop venue overlooked the river, all polished glass and steel, and crowded with investors, contractors, and city officials. Daniel had spent years charming through expensive dinners and confident handshakes, and his construction company had just landed a major commercial development contract near Fulton Market, and according to him, this night was supposed to celebrate the next chapter of our lives. And I remembered those exact words because of how cruelly ironic they became later. I stood near the bar that evening wearing a dark emerald dress I hadn't worn in years. At 42, I no longer looked like the woman Daniel married, but I still carried myself well. I exercised, kept my hair elegant and understated, and dressed with quiet sophistication. And I had spent most of my adult life believing dignity mattered more than desperation. Meanwhile, Daniel at 46 had entered the dangerous age some wealthy men reached when success convinced them the rules of ordinary decency no longer applied. Expensive watches appeared, gym memberships intensified, and conversations became centered around youth, freedom, reinvention. He had started using phrases like living authentically and not settling. I should have seen the affair coming. Maybe part of me did, but denial is a strange thing. It doesn't make you blind. It simply teaches you how to look away. Earlier that evening, I noticed Daniel checking his phone repeatedly while pretending to mingle with guests. Then he disappeared for nearly 20 minutes. When he returned, his mood had changed entirely. He looked energized and almost euphoric, like a man seconds away from revealing a winning lottery ticket. Then he tapped his champagne glass with a fork. The room quieted. "Can I have everyone's attention for a moment?" he announced with that smooth executive confidence people trusted far too easily. Guests turned toward him, smiling politely. I smiled too. God, I still smiled. Daniel wrapped one arm around a woman, standing just outside the crowd, gently pulling her forward into the light. At first, I could only see the outline of her figure, slim young, wearing a pale cream dress. Then he spoke. "She's younger than you, and she's pregnant with my child." A few nervous laughs escaped before the room realized he wasn't joking. My chest tightened instantly, though oddly enough, the pain wasn't immediate. Shock protects you at first. It creates distance between the mind and reality, as if your brain understands certain truths must be delivered slowly to avoid complete destruction. Daniel smirked. "I should have left you a long time ago." Then the woman beside him turned her face toward me, and the world stopped. "Lily," I whispered. My little sister's eyes filled with tears immediately, and the champagne glass slipped from my hand and shattered across the marble floor. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Lily looked impossibly young, standing there 26 years old, and soft blonde hair resting against bare shoulders, trembling beneath dozens of horrified stares. I remembered braiding that hair before school when she was a child, and I remembered packing her lunches after our parents died. I remembered working double shifts during college so she wouldn't lose her scholarship. And now she was carrying my husband's baby, and Daniel tightened his grip around her waist possessively, almost proudly, while whispers spread across the ballroom like wildfire. "You're unbelievable," I finally said, and though my voice sounded strangely calm to my own ears. Daniel shrugged carelessly. "You deserved honesty." "Honesty?" I stared at him at a party. "At least I'm not sneaking around anymore." And Lily began crying openly. "Evelyn, I'm sorry." I looked at her, then really looked at her, and something inside me cracked beyond repair. Not rage. Not yet. Rage comes later. First comes grief. And grief for the version of reality you can never return to. "How long?" I asked quietly. Neither answered immediately. That silence told me enough. Around us, guests avoided eye contact, and desperate to escape the discomfort without appearing rude. One woman near the back actually grabbed her purse and rushed toward the elevator. Another man muttered something about checking on valet parking, and cowards, every last one of them. Daniel exhaled impatiently, already annoyed by my reaction, which somehow felt even more humiliating than the betrayal itself. "A year," he admitted, almost, and the room tilted slightly. "A year. A full year of family dinners, birthdays, holidays, Sunday brunches, all poisoned beneath the surface, while I stood smiling like a fool. And you moved her into our guest house," I said slowly. Daniel didn't answer because he didn't need to. Suddenly, every strange moment from the past year rearranged itself into perfect, horrifying clarity. And the late-night business meetings, Lily defending him during arguments, the sudden tension whenever I entered a room unexpectedly, the expensive gifts Daniel claimed were client perks, and the whispered conversation stopping when I walked nearby. I had been living inside a lie so enormous it required dozens of smaller lies just to survive. Lily wiped tears from her cheeks shakily, and "We didn't mean for it to happen." I laughed, then one sharp, broken laugh that startled even me. "You didn't mean for it to happen?" I repeated, "and what exactly did you think would happen when you slept with your sister's husband?" Several people lowered their eyes. Daniel's expression hardened immediately, and that familiar irritation appeared, the same look he used whenever someone threatened his carefully controlled image. "Don't start acting dramatic," he said coldly. "This marriage has been over for years." And "No," I replied, "only for one of us." For the first time all evening, his confidence flickered slightly, because deep down, Daniel knew something important about me. I had never been weak, only loyal, and those are not the same thing. I grabbed my coat from the back of a chair, while Lily sobbed quietly beside him. Daniel made no effort to stop me. Why would he? In his mind, and the story was already finished. Older wife discarded, younger woman chosen. New baby coming, fresh beginning. Men like Daniel always believed consequences were things that happened to other people, and the elevator ride downstairs felt endless. My reflection in the mirrored walls looked pale and unfamiliar, as though I were watching another woman's life collapse in real time. Outside, and cold rain swept through the streets of Chicago, turning traffic lights into blurred streaks of red and gold across wet pavement. I sat inside my car without turning the engine on, and my hands trembled violently now. Not because Daniel cheated, not even because Lily betrayed me, but because an even more terrifying realization was beginning to surface beneath the heartbreak. And Daniel handled almost all our finances, the company accounts, the investments, the property paperwork, even the house. Over the years, I had trusted him completely while focusing on supporting his career, and maintaining our home, and helping raise his son from his first marriage. Whenever legal documents appeared, I signed them without suspicion, because that's what wives who trusted their husbands did. And suddenly, sitting alone in the rain with mascara streaking down my face, I understood something horrifying. I wasn't just losing my marriage. I might lose everything. And people love talking about betrayal, as if the pain comes all at once, like a gunshot or a lightning strike, immediate, violent, unmistakable. But real betrayal behaves more like poison, and it moves slowly through the bloodstream, settling into the quiet corners of your life, contaminating memories that once felt safe. 3 days after the party, I discovered I could no longer walk into my kitchen without wondering whether Daniel had kissed my sister against the marble counter while I slept upstairs. And that was the kind of pain infidelity left behind. It transformed ordinary spaces into crime scenes. The morning after the party, Daniel never came home. Instead, his attorney emailed mine, except I didn't have an attorney yet, which somehow made the message feel even colder. The subject line simply read, "Dissolution of marriage. No apology, no conversation, no shame. Just paperwork." And I sat alone at the dining room table, staring at the email while cold coffee sat untouched beside me. Outside, Chicago moved normally. People walked dogs. Buses groaned through intersections, and neighbors carried groceries upstairs. The world had the audacity to continue existing, while mine collapsed. By noon, Daniel finally called. "I think it's better if we keep things civil," he said immediately, and his tone, smooth and businesslike. "Dragging this out will only make it uglier." I almost admired his ability to sound reasonable while detonating someone else's life. "And you humiliated me in front of 200 people. You're focusing on emotions instead of reality." There it was, classic Daniel. Whenever he caused pain, he reframed the victim's reaction as the actual problem. "And I'm pregnant." Lily's voice suddenly echoed faintly somewhere near him. The sound nearly knocked the air from my lungs. Daniel lowered his voice. "Look, I'll make sure you're financially comfortable." And financially comfortable? As though 20 years of marriage could be converted into monthly deposits and legal percentages. "I built that company with you," I said quietly. "No," he corrected instantly. "And I built it. You supported me." The words hit harder than I expected, because part of me realized he genuinely believed them. That was the terrifying thing about selfish people. Eventually, they rewrote history so thoroughly that generosity became invisible to them. And Daniel no longer remembered the years I worked 2 jobs while he launched the business, or the nights I stayed awake balancing bills so payroll checks wouldn't bounce. He remembered only his success, and successful men often convince themselves they arrived there alone. "I want you out of the house within 30 days, he continued. "I'm being generous here, Evelyn. Generous." And I ended the call without another word, because I finally understood something crucial. There was no remaining piece of my husband worth saving. For the next week, humiliation followed me everywhere. And people at church stared too long. Neighbors suddenly became awkward and overly kind. One woman at the grocery store squeezed my arm gently and whispered, "I'm praying for you," and with the same tone people used at funerals. Meanwhile, social media became unbearable. Daniel and Lily weren't officially public yet, but rumors traveled fast in wealthy Chicago circles, and someone posted blurry photos from the party online. Comments exploded underneath. "Midlife crisis. Poor wife. Disgusting. She's young enough to be his daughter." I stopped reading after that, and then Lily showed up at the house. I almost didn't open the door when the security camera alerted me, but curiosity won. She stood on the porch wearing an oversized sweater, her eyes swollen from crying, and seeing her there felt surreal, like my brain still couldn't fully connect the little girl I raised with the woman sleeping beside my husband. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then she whispered, "Anne, can I come in?" No, she flinched visibly. Rain drizzled softly behind her while passing cars sprayed water across the street. October had turned bitterly cold overnight, and yet some stubborn part of me noticed Lily wasn't wearing a proper coat. Old instincts die hard. "I know you hate me," she said shakily. Hate would actually be easier. Tears spilled down her cheeks instantly. "Anne, I never wanted to hurt you." "Then why did you?" Her mouth opened, then closed again because there was no answer. Not one that sounded reasonable out loud. Finally, she whispered, "I love him." And the simplicity of it stunned me. Not because it justified anything it didn't, but because human beings destroyed entire families every day for feelings they mistook as destiny. And people wanted passion so badly they convinced themselves ordinary morality no longer applied to them. "How long?" I asked. Lily looked away. 9 months. 9 months. And nearly an entire year of smiling across dinner tables while secretly sleeping with my husband. I gripped the door frame tighter. He said your marriage was already dead. And did he also tell you he sleeps with his phone face down because he's terrified of being caught? She blinked rapidly. Interesting. A seed of doubt entered her expression for the first time. He said, "Anne, you stopped loving him." I laughed bitterly. "No, Lily, I stopped worshiping him." Silence stretched painfully between us. Then she rested a trembling hand against her stomach. And despite everything, Anne, my chest tightened with grief. Not for Daniel. Never again for Daniel. For her, because beneath all the betrayal, Lily was still the frightened little sister who once crawled into my bed after nightmares. "Anne, what happens now?" she whispered. I looked at her for a long moment before answering honestly. "You live with the choices you made." Then I closed the door. That night, I finally called Marcus Reed, and I hadn't spoken to Marcus in almost 15 years, but back in college, we'd been close friends, close enough that Daniel once accused him of being in love with me. At the time, I thought my husband sounded jealous. Now I realized he had simply recognized integrity in another man and resented it instinctively. And Marcus arrived at my house the next afternoon, carrying takeout coffee and a leather briefcase. The moment he saw my face, his expression darkened. "Jesus, Evelyn," that nearly broke me. Not pity, and not curiosity, just genuine anger on my behalf. We sat at the kitchen table for hours while I explained everything. The affair, the pregnancy, the public humiliation, the divorce papers, and Marcus listened quietly without interrupting, though several times I noticed his jaw tighten. Then he asked a question that changed the direction of my entire life. "Anne, how involved are you in the company finances?" I hesitated. "Not very." "How not very?" The shame hit me immediately. "I sign things sometimes," I admitted. "Tax documents, refinancing, paperwork, and investment transfers." Marcus stared at me carefully. "Did you read them?" Daniel always handled that side of things. The silence afterward felt dangerous. Finally, Marcus leaned back slowly. "Evelyn, Anne," he said carefully, "I need you to understand something. Men who leave marriages this aggressively usually prepare financially long before they leave emotionally." Cold spread through my stomach. "Anne, what does that mean?" "It means there's a decent chance your husband has been moving assets." Suddenly, I couldn't breathe properly. Marcus opened his briefcase and removed a yellow legal pad. "Anne, tell me every account you know about." For the next 2 hours, we built the ugly outline of my marriage piece by piece. Properties, investments, business accounts, retirement funds, insurance policies, and with every detail, Marcus grew quieter. Finally, he looked up. "I think Daniel's hiding money." The room seemed to shrink around me. "He wouldn't do that." Marcus held my gaze steadily. "Anne, he already slept with your sister." That ended the last fragile threat of denial inside me. Over the following days, Marcus began investigating quietly through legal channels. Meanwhile, Daniel grew increasingly arrogant. He sent assistants to collect clothes from the house. He emailed me spreadsheets dividing furniture, as though we were splitting office supplies instead of a life. And then came the final insult. A package arrived containing divorce papers and a handwritten note from Daniel. "You'll be happier once this is over. Trust me." I stared at the sentence for nearly a full minute, and then something unexpected happened. For the first time since the party, I stopped crying. Not because I healed, because something colder replaced the grief. Clarity. And Daniel thought I would collapse quietly, sign whatever he placed in front of me, and disappear with polite dignity. While he started a glamorous new life with my younger sister, Anne, he thought loyalty had made me weak. He was about to learn the difference between kindness and surrender. And for the first time in weeks, I finally slept through the night. And revenge is rarely born from rage alone. Rage burns too fast. The most dangerous kind of revenge grows slowly, quietly beneath the surface, fed by humiliation, sharpened by patience, and guided by the calm realization that the people who underestimated you have already handed you their weakness. 3 weeks after the party, I stopped wearing my wedding ring. Not dramatically, and not ceremonially. I simply slid it off one morning while standing at the bathroom sink, placed it inside the medicine cabinet, and closed the door without another thought. And the gesture felt strangely unemotional, which frightened me more than grief ever had, because grief meant love still existed somewhere underneath. This felt different. This felt like survival. And outside Chicago was settling into early winter, and the trees along our street had lost nearly all their leaves, exposing skeletal branches against gray skies, while cold wind swept through downtown corridors, hard enough to make strangers walk faster, with their heads lowered. And the city looked harsher now, stripped down to steel and concrete, and somehow that matched my mood perfectly. Marcus called almost every day. At first it was paperwork, financial disclosures, and property records, business filings. Then gradually, his tone changed from cautious concern to quiet disbelief. "Daniel's been transferring money for over a year," he told me one afternoon, and I sat at the kitchen counter holding untouched tea. "How much?" "A lot." "How much is a lot?" Marcus exhaled slowly. "Enough that a judge is going to have questions." And that was the first moment I felt something dangerously close to satisfaction. Not joy, not yet, but movement. For weeks, I had felt trapped beneath Daniel's choices, and drowning inside humiliation he controlled completely. Now, for the first time, cracks were appearing in the version of reality he created, and Daniel hated losing control. And Marcus uncovered shell accounts connected to one of Daniel's development partners, and suspicious transfers hidden beneath consulting fees and property investments quietly shifted into corporate holdings months before he announced the divorce. None of it looked clean. And you know what his biggest mistake was? Marcus said during one meeting. "Go what?" He got arrogant. I almost smiled, because that part was true. And Daniel had spent so many years winning that he stopped believing consequences applied to him. Wealth had transformed caution into entitlement, and he assumed everyone around him existed, either to admire him or forgive him. Men like that eventually self-destruct. The only question was how much damage they caused first. Meanwhile, Daniel and Lily officially moved into a luxury condo near Gold Coast, overlooking Lake Michigan. I learned that through social media, naturally. Apparently, subtlety no longer interested them, and photos appeared online constantly. Dinner dates, ultrasound pictures, weekend trips, captions about new beginnings and living authentically. The comments underneath were vicious, and some defended them, because there were always people willing to romanticize betrayal. if the participants looked attractive enough, but most reactions were brutal. Home wrecker. Disgusting. Anne. Imagine doing that to your own sister. Daniel pretended not to care publicly, but according to mutual friends, he was furious privately. His image mattered deeply to him, and especially in business circles, where reputation translated directly into money. And Chicago, despite its size, remained a surprisingly small city among wealthy professionals. People talked at night, and I sometimes imagined Lily reading those comments alone while Daniel slept beside her. I wondered whether guilt kept her awake yet, and I wondered whether she finally understood that stolen happiness always came with interest attached. Then something unexpected happened. I started working again, not because I suddenly felt inspired, and because I needed income. 20 years earlier, before Daniel's company consumed our marriage, I worked in architectural interior design. I had been good at it too, creative, disciplined, ambitious, and then Daniel's business expanded rapidly, and gradually my career became less practical for our family's needs. That was how sacrifice usually happened in marriages. Not through dramatic ultimatums, but through 1,000 small compromises that slowly erased one person while elevating the other. A former colleague named Sandra offered me temporary contract work, redesigning boutique hotel interiors in River North. The pay wasn't extraordinary, but I accepted immediately. And on my first day back inside a professional office, I nearly cried in the parking garage, not from sadness, from shame, and because I realized how thoroughly I had abandoned parts of myself while building Daniel's life. Sandra hugged me tightly when I arrived. "You still look elegant enough to intimidate clients," and she joked gently. I laughed for the first time in weeks. The work helped. Not magically, not instantly, but steadily. Design required focus, precision decision-making, and it forced my brain to engage with color palettes and lighting plans instead of obsessively replaying Betrayal at 3:50 in the morning. More importantly, it reminded me I still existed outside my marriage. And Daniel noticed the change almost immediately. "You're working?" he asked during one tense phone conversation about property division. "Yes," a pause. "For how long?" "As long as I want." And something subtle shifted in his tone. Then irritation perhaps, or discomfort, because dependent women are easier to discard than independent ones. Meanwhile, Lily's fairy tale life began cracking around the edges. I saw it first during a court-mandated financial meeting at Marcus's office. Daniel arrived late, wearing an expensive charcoal coat and visibly distracted by non-stop messages buzzing across his phone. Lily accompanied him quietly, noticeably pregnant now, though she looked exhausted instead of glowing. Her eyes found mine briefly and then lowered immediately. Daniel spent most of the meeting arguing aggressively over assets he insisted belonged solely to him. The more Marcus challenged inconsistencies in the financial records, and the more defensive Daniel became. Finally, Marcus slid several documents across the table calmly. These transfers could become problematic in court. Daniel's expression hardened instantly. "They're legal, and some might be." The silence afterward felt electric. For the first time since the affair became public, I saw genuine unease flicker behind Daniel's confidence, and Lily noticed it too. On the way out, she touched my arm softly near the elevator. "Can we talk sometime?" she whispered. "No." Her face collapsed slightly, though I kept walking, because forgiveness was nowhere near possible yet. A week later, another crack appeared. Daniel's company lost a major municipal contract. Officially, the city blamed budget reevaluation, but rumors spread quickly that several investors grew nervous after learning about internal financial inconsistencies. Daniel denied everything publicly, of course, but the timing was impossible to ignore. And then came Thanksgiving. For the first time in my adult life, Lily wasn't invited to the family gathering. Neither was Daniel. My Aunt Carol announced it bluntly over the phone, and we're not pretending this is normal. Apparently, even relatives who once defended Lily were struggling, now that the scandal became permanent reality instead of shocking gossip. That evening, I hosted a quiet dinner at my house for a few family members and Daniel's adult son, Ryan, who had stopped speaking to his father entirely after the affair. At one point, Ryan stared down at his plate and muttered bitterly, "He destroyed everything for some fantasy." I looked at him carefully. "No," I said softly, "he destroyed everything because nobody ever forced him to face consequences before." The room went silent after that because everyone knew it was true. By December, Daniel's temper became increasingly public, mutual friends reported arguments between him and Lily at restaurants, tent scenes during company events, and one particularly ugly confrontation outside a prenatal appointment where Daniel shouted loudly enough for strangers to stare. Pressure changes people, or rather it reveals them. One snowy evening, Marcus called me after reviewing new financial records. "I need to ask you something carefully," he said. "Okay." "Did Daniel ever use company funds for personal expenses?" I frowned. "Probably." "Why?" "Because if these records are accurate, he's been moving business money to cover private investments." Cold unease settled into my chest. "How bad is that?" Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Potentially catastrophic." That same night, around 11:30, my doorbell rang unexpectedly, and I opened the door to find Lily stand aside in the snow, visibly shaking beneath a wool coat, tears streaming down her face, and her mascara had smeared beneath swollen eyes, and one hand rested protectively against her pregnant stomach. For several seconds, she couldn't speak. Then finally, she whispered the words that changed everything. "He's cheating on me too." And for the first time since the night my life shattered, I saw fear replacing guilt in my sister's eyes. Real fear. For a long time after Lily spoke, neither of us moved. Snow drifted silently behind her beneath the porch, light soft and deceptively peaceful, while downtown traffic murmured faintly several streets away. Chicago winters had a way of making the world feel emotionally honest. The cold stripped away performance vanity illusion. People showed up shivering, exhausted, human, and Lily looked painfully human standing in front of me that night. Not seductive, not triumphant, not the glamorous young Mistress Daniel had proudly displayed at the rooftop party, just a frightened pregnant woman whose entire fantasy had collapsed. "He's upstairs with her right now," she whispered. I stared at her carefully. "Who?" "A 23-year-old intern from his office." The irony was so vicious, it almost felt theatrical. Lily let out a shaky laugh that immediately turned into sobbing. "I know," she said through tears. "I know how pathetic this sounds." Number pathetic would have been pretending she didn't deserve consequences. This was something else. This was reality arriving. I should have slammed the door in her face. Part of me wanted to. For weeks, I had imagined moments like this. Daniel abandoned Lily, devastated karma finally collecting its debt. In my angriest fantasies, I pictured myself delivering cold speeches while they begged for forgiveness neither deserved. But real life rarely satisfies revenge fantasies cleanly. Because when suffering finally arrives, it often looks less glamorous than expected. Lily's face was pale from crying. Her lips trembled uncontrollably from cold and stress. One hand pressed protectively against the life growing inside her, an innocent child who had done nothing except arrive through ugly circumstances. And despite everything she stole from me, she was still my little sister. That truth hurt worst of all. "Come inside, I said quietly. Lily broke down completely the moment she crossed the doorway. I sat her at the kitchen table while she cried into both hands, shoulders shaking violently beneath her coat. And the same kitchen where she once baked Christmas cookies with me. The same kitchen where Daniel probably kissed her while I slept upstairs. And strange how trauma made memories overlap until the mind no longer knew which version of the past to trust. I thought he loved me, she whispered eventually, and I poured hot tea into a mug without answering immediately, because he probably did love her in the shallow, selfish way. Men like Daniel loved anything that fed their ego, but selfish love always expired the moment sacrifice became inconvenient. He said, "You stopped caring about him." Lily continued weakly. "He said you treated him like a business partner instead of a husband." And I finally looked at her directly. "And what did he say about cheating on you?" Her eyes filled again. "Nothing, of course. Daniel's behavior wasn't about love. It was appetite. And appetites only grew hungrier when constantly indulged. He started staying late at work," Lily whispered. "Then he became secretive with his phone. He'd leave the room to answer calls. Last week, I found messages between him and that girl. She stopped speaking, swallowing hard, the same way you probably found ours. A long silence settled between us. Then, very softly, she asked the question she was truly there to ask. Do you hate me? I could have lied. But there had already been enough lies between us to poison an entire lifetime. Yes, I answered honestly. She flinched like she'd been struck, but I continued quietly. I don't want your child punished for your mistakes. That broke her completely. Lily covered her face and sobbed while I stood motionless beside the counter, emotionally exhausted beyond anger. Revenge fantasies never included moments like this, and the uncomfortable realization that even people who hurt you profoundly remain painfully human afterward. Around 2 a.m, I made up the guest room, and not the old guest house behind the property where the affair likely began. The small upstairs room overlooking the backyard. Lily paused in the doorway before entering. You don't owe me this. No, I replied. I don't. Then I turned away before either of us could say more. The next morning, Marcus called with devastating news for Daniel. Federal investigators were reviewing irregularities connected to several construction contracts tied to his company. Not criminal charges yet, but close enough to terrify him. He's panicking, Marcus said. His attorneys requested emergency settlement discussions. I leaned against the kitchen island while Lily slept upstairs. What changed? Pressure, Marcus answered simply. Financial institutions get nervous when divorce attorneys and forensic accountants start finding hidden money. For the first time in months, I felt calm instead of overwhelmed. Not because Daniel was suffering, because the truth was finally surfacing. That afternoon, Daniel arrived at the house unannounced. The moment I opened the door, I barely recognized him. He looked exhausted, not dramatically ruined, not yet, but diminished somehow. His expensive coat hung carelessly unbuttoned. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and tension radiated from him like heat. Then he noticed Lily's suitcase near the stairs. His expression hardened instantly. She's here. Yes. Daniel laughed bitterly. Unbelievable. No, I replied calmly. Predictable. He stepped inside without invitation, pacing the foyer aggressively. She overreacted to you cheating on your pregnant girlfriend. His jaw tightened. It's complicated. I almost smiled. That phrase, men destroyed entire families, then called the aftermath complicated. She had no right running back to you, he snapped. Interesting, I said softly. Considering she learned that behavior from you. Daniel stared at me for several seconds, clearly realizing the version of me standing before him no longer behaved the way he expected. Good. You think this makes you morally superior? He asked coldly, taking her in. No, I think it makes me different from you. Something dangerous flashed across his face. then anger mixed with wounded pride, and because narcissistic people could tolerate hatred more easily than indifference, and I was beginning to feel indifferent. You know, Daniel muttered, and none of this would have happened if you'd paid more attention to our marriage. There it was. The final refuge of selfish men everywhere blamed the woman they betrayed. For years, and that kind of accusation would have shattered me. I would have replayed every argument, every exhausted evening, every missed emotional signal, searching desperately for the point where I failed. And not anymore. You had a choice, I said quietly. Every single day you had a choice. Daniel scoffed. You act like you were perfect. No, I replied. I acted faithful. Silence. And then footsteps creaked softly upstairs. Lily appeared halfway down the staircase, wearing one of my sweaters, visibly tense the moment she saw Daniel. For a brief second, and the three of us stood frozen inside the wreckage we created together. Daniel's expression softened slightly when he looked at her stomach. Lily, come home. Her face crumpled immediately. Which home? And she whispered. That landed harder than shouting ever could. Daniel ran a frustrated hand through his hair. I made a mistake. Lily stared at him in disbelief. You said that about Evelyn too, and the room went completely silent, because suddenly everyone understood the terrible truth at the center of all this. Daniel's betrayals weren't isolated events. They were patterns, and patterns repeated, and eventually he left without another word. The front door closed heavily behind him, and for several moments neither Lily nor I spoke. Then she sat slowly on the stairs and whispered, Anne, do you think he ever loved either of us? I considered the question carefully. Yes, I answered at last, but not enough to become a good man. That distinction mattered, Anne, because love without character eventually destroyed everything around it. A week later came the mediation hearing, and Daniel arrived with 2 attorneys, and the same expensive arrogance he always carried into professional spaces. But the confidence looked strained now, thinner, somehow less convincing, and Marcus sat beside me calmly, while financial records covered the conference table. Then came the moment everything shifted, permanently. Marcus presented evidence of Daniel's hidden transfers and shell accounts, undisclosed property holdings, misappropriated company funds. The mediator's expression changed immediately. One attorney removed his glasses slowly. Daniel went pale, and for the first time since the affair began, fear appeared openly in his eyes. Real fear, not fear of losing me. Fear of losing power, and somehow that felt far more satisfying. And by the time spring returned to Chicago, the worst of the scandal had already burned through the city. That was the strange thing about public humiliation. It felt permanent while you were living inside it, and yet eventually the world moved on to fresher disasters, newer gossip, younger scandals. People who once whispered your name over cocktails slowly returned to discussing politics, stock markets, vacations, and surgeries, grandchildren. Life continued, just not the same life. My divorce from Daniel was finalized 11 months after the night of the party. The settlement shocked almost everyone who knew him, and not because Daniel lost everything, because he lost enough. The forensic investigation into his finances uncovered years of hidden transfers and fraudulent reporting tied to company accounts, and criminal charges were ultimately avoided through enormous financial penalties and private settlements. But the damage to his reputation was irreversible. Investors withdrew quietly, and 2 major partners dissolved contracts. One board member resigned publicly after internal records became impossible to defend. For a man like Daniel, public disgrace hurt worse than financial loss, and money could be rebuilt, admiration could not. Meanwhile, I kept working. That became the real revenge in the end. Not screaming, not public meltdowns, not destroying his car or humiliating him online. And It was waking up every morning and slowly rebuilding a life he thought could not exist without him. Sandra eventually offered me a permanent leadership role at the design firm, and then 6 months later, helped me launch my own boutique interior studio, specializing in historic hotel restorations across Chicago and Milwaukee. The projects were demanding, elegant, creative, and the kind of work that reminded me who I had been before I disappeared inside somebody else's ambition. For the first time in years, I made decisions without asking permission, and I bought furniture Daniel would have hated. I painted rooms lighter colors. I traveled alone sometimes. Small freedoms became sacred after decades of emotional compromise. And people often imagine healing as dramatic, a sudden breakthrough, a powerful speech, some cinematic closure. Real healing was quieter than that. It happened gradually in ordinary moments, and laughing without guilt, sleeping through the night, hearing Daniel's name without feeling physically sick. It happened the first morning I looked in the mirror and no longer saw a discarded wife and just myself. Lily gave birth to a little girl in late June. Her name was Grace. When Lily called me from the hospital, I almost didn't answer, but I did. And an hour later, I found myself walking through maternity corridors, carrying flowers with trembling hands, emotionally unprepared for what waited inside that room. Lily looked exhausted, smaller somehow, and motherhood had stripped away the last traces of fantasy from her face. There was no glamorous affair left now, no exciting rebellion, no intoxicating secrecy, and just responsibility, fear, and a newborn child sleeping quietly against her chest. Then she looked up at me and started crying immediately. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. Not defensive this time, not confused, and just broken honesty. I stood beside the hospital bed for a long moment before answering. "You already said that, I know," her voice cracked. "But now I finally understand what I destroyed." And that sentence stayed with me, because suffering changes people differently than guilt does. Guilt still protects the ego somehow. It focuses on how terrible you feel, but true understanding forces you to confront the pain you caused others without centering yourself inside it. Lily finally understood, not because Daniel betrayed her too, because she became a mother, and suddenly she could comprehend the depth of trust, sacrifice, and protection that love actually required. I looked down at baby Grace, sleeping peacefully and completely innocent beneath the wreckage surrounding her existence, and felt something inside me soften despite myself. Not forgiveness, not fully, but the beginning of mercy. And Daniel visited the hospital briefly that afternoon. The tension inside the room became immediate the second he walked in. He still dressed expensively and still carried traces of the polished executive charm that once impressed people, but the cracks showed clearly now. Stress had aged him rapidly over the past year, and his confidence looked rehearsed instead of natural, his smile thinner, his posture heavier, and for the first time since I met him, he seemed uncertain around me. "Evelyn," he said carefully. "Daniel," and silence. Lily kept her eyes lowered while adjusting the baby blanket nervously. Daniel glanced between us awkwardly, probably stunned to find us in the same room without open warfare, but tragedy sometimes created strange forms of peace after enough destruction exhausted everyone involved. "How's business?" I asked calmly. His jaw tightened almost invisibly. "Fine," which meant terrible, and we both knew it. Daniel stepped closer to the crib and stared quietly at his daughter. Something vulnerable flickered across his face. Then grief perhaps, or regret. Maybe both. "And I never meant for things to end like this," he murmured. I almost laughed. Not cruelly, just tiredly. Nobody ever meant for things to end this way. And people simply kept making selfish decisions while convincing themselves consequences would somehow remain manageable. Then eventually consequences arrived all at once. A month later, Daniel moved into a luxury apartment, less than half the size of our former home. After selling multiple assets to stabilize his finances, several longtime friends distanced themselves quietly, and Ryan still barely spoke to him. His social circle shrank dramatically once admiration no longer came attached to money and influence, and Lily never went back. And that mattered more than Daniel expected, because men like him always assumed women would eventually return if they apologized correctly. But some damage permanently changes how people see you. By autumn, my relationship with Lily settled into something fragile but real. We were not close the way we once were. Perhaps we never would be again. Certain betrayals left scars too deep for complete restoration, but we tried. Sometimes that was enough. On quiet Sundays, Lily brought Grace to my house while I cooked dinner. We avoided discussing Daniel most of the time. Instead, we talked about sleepless nights, daycare costs, recipes, weather work, ordinary conversations, slowly rebuilding trust molecule by molecule. One evening after Lily left, I stood alone washing dishes when I realized something surprising. I no longer wanted revenge, not because Daniel deserved forgiveness, because I no longer needed his suffering to feel whole. That realization felt like freedom. A few weeks before Christmas, I ran into Daniel unexpectedly at a small cafe near Michigan Avenue. Snow drifted softly outside while muted jazz played overhead, and for a moment, we simply stared at each other across the room, like survivors from different sides of the same disaster. He looked older, not physically alone spiritually, and there was a heaviness around him now that expensive clothes couldn't hide. "Can I sit?" he asked quietly. I considered refusing, then nodded once. We spoke politely at first about neutral things: work, Grace. Two strangers carefully navigating the ruins of intimacy. Then finally, Daniel looked down at his coffee cup and said, the one thing I never truly expected to hear from him: "I destroyed everything." The words hung between us heavily. A year earlier, hearing them might have satisfied me deeply. Now they only made me sad, because despite everything, I once loved this man enough to build my entire life around him. And somewhere beneath all the anger, part of me mourned the person he could have been if arrogance hadn't consumed him first. I studied him quietly before answering. "No, Daniel," I said softly, "you destroyed yourself." His eyes lowered immediately. Not defensive this time, just defeated. And suddenly I understood the final truth about revenge. The most complete form of justice was never watching someone suffer. It was surviving them without becoming cruel yourself. I stood, gathered my coat, and walked toward the door, while snow continued falling outside in soft white silence. Behind me, Daniel remained seated alone at the table, and for the first time in nearly 20 years, I felt completely free. If this story touched you in any way, if it reminded you of the cost of betrayal, the strength it takes to rebuild, or the quiet power of choosing dignity over bitterness, take a moment to share your thoughts below. And if you enjoy deep emotional stories about love, loss, justice, and second chances, don't forget to subscribe and join us for the next journey.